So, hi everybody, I hope you're well. Welcome to the latest recruiting superhero gym, where myself, Alex from Nurture It, looking to give you the skills you need to be just amazing recruiters and achieve what you want to achieve out of running your desks. Now, today is going to be a super exciting day. It might seem like a dry topic, but we're here to talk about GDPR, which for the uninitiated is the General Data Protection Regulations. And I know very little about this, but I do know a little bit about recruitment. So what I've done is I've drafted in an expert. I got Francis Lewis, who's head of contingent staffing from Osborne Clarke, one of the UK's largest law firms. Francis has been working in the recruitment industry as a lawyer for almost 20 years. Is that right, Francis?
Yep.
So she knows what recruiters are like. She knows the things that we want to do. And so she's going to be here today to answer questions for us from a recruiter's perspective. What actually does GDPR mean when it comes to working at desk on a day-to-day basis? So without further ado, I'm going to say hello, Francis.
Hello.
So I've given you a little bit of an intro there, but just want to give us a little potted history of your career supporting recruiters, so we've all got an idea of the knowledge you've got that's relevant for us.
Okay, well, thanks, Alex. Well, as Alex mentioned, I've been advising the recruitment sector, both in the UK and more recently globally for the last 20 years. And as a sector-focused group of lawyers, we specialise in helping recruiters with a whole range of legal issues, whether it be regulatory, workplace tax. We buy and sell recruitment businesses as well, so we get involved in recruitment M&A, work a lot with the private equity investors. So when we're advising and when we're looking at issues like GDPR, which, as Alex says, is not the most exciting subject in the world, we do try and make it relevant to your business, particularly in terms of looking at how it could affect your shareholder value. And that's our starting point, really, to make sure that you preserve the value and enhance the value in your company. A lot of our clients are working towards exit, so they want to get the best possible sell price on exit, and everything we do is really geared towards helping them lock in that value, and this is one of those key issues.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to this. We've got a couple of people with connection issues, so rest assured, if you've got connection issues, then we will be sending out a stream, a recording of this after the show. So just as a starter for 10, Francis, could you just share with us, just in a few minutes, what is GDPR and how might it affect recruiters that sit there and work desks and find candidates and fill jobs on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, well, that's a bit of a killer question in a few minutes, and it's one that would require a superhero. but just to sort of pull out a few important points. I mean, the GDPR builds on the Data Protection Act, which has been around since 1997. Lots of businesses have sort of lived with it reluctantly, and I think it's probably fair to say that there hasn't been a huge amount of scary enforcement going on, particularly in the staffing sector. Having said that, there have been some cases where the likes of Hayes have got some good results on the use of LinkedIn, and that's partly linked to use of the Data Protection Act. The GDPR will build on the rights that data subjects have, so that as from, I think it's 23rd of May next year, there will be new regulations in place, and data subjects will have enhanced rights. And this has really been in response to the growing use of data since the Data Protection Act was put in place.
Right. As data subject, so that means a candidate?
Yeah.
And does that also mean client data as well?
It's any individual, so it could be a candidate, it could be a client contact. So it's not just candidate end that you're looking at as a staffing business. It could be a contact in another staffing company that you supply into. So if you're supplying into an RPO, for instance, it could be a contact. Okay. So it's basically any individual's personal details that you hold on your system. And hold is quite relevant because you can obviously hold people's data on your system and not do anything with it. But even if you're just holding it, you're still processing it. So it's still covered by the Data Protection Act and GDPR.
Okay, great. So you're saying this requires not just the data you've got of active candidates and clients today, but the database of historical information that you've got from the past as well. Right.
Yeah, very much so.
Cool.
Yeah, so a lot of organisations are having to do some fairly massive clear up jobs and to get rid of old data that's no longer relevant or useful.
Right.
Because
okay.
it's actually going to be an offence to hold on to it.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll get onto that in a second. So there's 3 topics that we from the questions that we sourced from the crowd. One is regarding consent. So the assumption that, well, as long as I get the candidate's permission, I can do whatever I want. The second thing we're going to cover is, well, I find a lot of my information on LinkedIn. So surely if it's publicly available, I can do whatever I want. And the third thing is just regarding who owns the data when someone leaves an organization. We've had an interesting LinkedIn chat this week around when people leave agencies, taking data from those companies, how that sort of sits from a legal perspective. So if we could sort of start with consent. So the assumption is, Francis, that, well, if a candidate says that I can put their CV on my system, then I can do whatever I want with it once it's on the system. Is that right?
No.
Oh.
No. So
something so black and white as that. So tell me why.
You have to. You can use consent. Obviously, consent is one of the lawful bases for processing the data. And you've got to have a lawful basis for processing. So consent is one of those. But the consent has to be freely given. It can't be implied anymore. So under the existing Act, you can rely on implied consent. That's going to go. So it's got to be express, freely given consent.
Right. So if we put that into reality, then, so in the past, if someone applied to a job advert to me, I could make an assumption that meant they wanted to be on the database because they applied for a job. So surely that meant they wanted to be on the database.
Yeah, I think that as soon as a candidate said yes to anything, it was just assumed that could be stored indefinitely and that they could be put forward to various different vacancies.
Okay.
Not simply the one that they applied for. So going forward, it's going to be slightly different because the consent has to be in relation to a specific request, and you have to tell the candidate exactly what you're going to do with their data. So you have to make it very clear to them at some point in the process what you're going to do. Well, the fact that you've got their data. Secondly, the basis on which you're going to process, what's your lawful ground for doing so. And thirdly, what are you actually going to do with it? What is the purpose of having that data and what is the purpose of processing? So in practical terms, that's going to mean considering how you're going to get that consent and at what point you're going to provide that information to the candidate or to anyone else whose data you're holding. And for recruitment, that's one of the biggest challenges at the moment, coming up with a process that actually allows for all of that.
So you're saying that so if they apply for a job, it's not just enough to say, by the way, by applying for could you just tell them, by the way, you've applied for a job, I'm going to put you on the system, and it means I'm going to keep it on the system and keep you in touch with what other jobs are on there going forward. Could I just cover it with a statement like that and then just click OK? Or
I think you'd have to be a bit more specific than that. So again, this is untested at the moment, but you'd want to be as specific as you possibly could in your request for consent.
Okay.
And that's one of the reasons why consent is only one of the issues that you might want to look at. There are different grounds for processing.
Okay. What are the other grounds for processing, Francis?
You can lawfully process data if it's in connection with a contract between you and the data subject, which again, in the context of recruitment, certainly, permanent and temp recruitment are slightly different, aren't they? But in the context of either, at what point do you actually have a contract with them? And that's not always obvious. It may be that in respect of permanent recruitment, you might be able to rely on that ground if all of the steps you're taking are pre-contract, and then arguably once you've been engaged to provide work finding services by the candidate, because this is also regulated by the conduct regs, there is effectively a contract there. That may be one way of doing it.
So you're saying that if the candidate says, put me forward to that job, I can hold their data for as long as they're in that process, because effectively I'm fulfilling an agreement that I've got between myself and the candidate.
Yeah, that's right. So that may be one way of doing it, and that lends itself more to perm than temp, because obviously with temp, usually you don't have a contract with the individual at all, because they're being paid by somebody else. I think that's a reality with most agencies, although I'm sure there'll be some of you listening who do engage temps directly.
Any non-PAYE recruitment tends to either be with a limited company or an umbrella, I guess.
Yeah. So in that case, you don't have a contract with the candidate. You have a contract with the postal service company or the umbrella company. So that complicates things for the purposes of that lawful ground for processing. So the other one that the recruitment industry is looking at is the legitimate business purpose. And it may well be that that becomes the best ground to rely on. The problem is at the moment, we don't have any guidance specifically on whether or not the use of the data for the purposes of progressing the recruitment process would be regarded as a legitimate business purpose. So the examples that are currently around are things like transferring data within a set of group companies. That is regarded as a legitimate process, but that's slightly different, I think, to a recruitment business saying that we are entitled to use your data because we are in recruitment, and that's you've given it to us in the first place. Right. So it remains to be seen whether that is something that you will be able to use.
Okay.
But you can use one of those other grounds. That's certainly worth looking into, because it removes your need to rely on consent.
I guess also there's a need from a compliance perspective. So, for instance, if you made a placement, you need to prove the right to work in the UK. So you'd probably need to keep a copy of that person's passport on file, to sort of just to prove that you fulfilled your other statutory obligations.
That's right, but that's a very specific use of the data. So that doesn't necessarily give you the right to use the data to actually, I suppose, put that candidate forward to a potential hirer.
Okay. And how would
there are circumstances within the process that will give you lawful grounds for processing. It's going to be a sort of combination of a number of different grounds, I think.
Okay. And just before we move on, we've got a question from Alan, who's asked, how would these regulations impact corporate recruiters, so internal recruiters that work within organizations?
Well, they apply in exactly the same way. I mean, we did a seminar last week, actually, to HR professionals who were, some of them who were involved in internal in-house recruitment. And it was quite interesting to sort of hear what they had to say, because obviously they're having to deal with external agencies, and they can be several, I suppose, depending on the size of the supply chain involved, there can be several steps removed from the actual individual who would, in most cases, be giving consent. So in normal sort of HR situations where you've got direct employment, the internal recruiter has an opportunity to speak to the actual candidate. In other situations where you're using an external agency, that's not always the case. And
what about where internal recruiters might fire out CVs to line managers? Would that be considered processing and using that data, or because it's in the same organisation, does it not need the same consent?
Oh, I see what you mean. I see where that question's coming from now.
The CV comes into an internal
recruiter. What's part of the legitimate purpose?
Yeah.
I think the same would apply. I mean, it may well be that it would lend itself to a legitimate purpose basis, but Yeah, because it is much closer, isn't it, to sending personal data around group companies.
Mm-hmm.
So it is more akin to that.
Okay. I guess it's also what that then person does with it. So if they don't do anything with it, then you haven't necessarily processed it badly. But if they then go and hand it to someone else or externally, then you're misusing that data.
I think, I mean, the candidate would have to be informed at some point that their data would be shared internally.
Okay, cool. So Francis, we've spoken quite a lot about things from a candidate perspective. I think Neil Phillips has got a good question, is that, am I allowed to store clients' email addresses and maybe job description for email marketing purposes? Not necessarily a mass email, but maybe for just emailing them to say, hi, this is what I do. So how does it impact things from a client data perspective?
Well, the same principles apply. So if you to the extent you've got their personal details on your system, you should be informing them that you've got them and what you're going to do with them. So if part of that is to send them updates or to promote various initiatives that you're doing for their benefit, then you have to provide that information, and that's commonly called a fair processing notice.
Okay. So if I connect with someone on LinkedIn, would I then have to email them a text, send them a direct message going, just so you know, I'm putting your details on our CRM so we can keep in touch? Is that the type of thing you'd have to? Because effectively if you can't keep a name and a phone number on your system, then you'd sort of start to wonder what the point of the system is.
Yeah, I mean, there's again, we sort of touched on, I spoke to Alex earlier about this. It's very much going to be a case of making a risk assessment. I mean, the whole of GDPR compliance is basically going to have to be a risk assessment. There is going to be no such thing as 100% compliance. It is a holy grail, really. So there is a concept of proportionality. So you have to look at how likely this is going to cause detriment for the candidate or the client contact, and then factor that into your risk assessment. Now, ideally, if you are taking details off LinkedIn, at some point before you actually use that data, i.e. if as a candidate you use it to submit to some kind of hiring client, it doesn't matter what you want to do with it, but before you actually want to do more than just hold it, you should be contacting the candidate by LinkedIn messaging, whatever it is you've got for them, just to let them know, I've got your data and I'm thinking of using it, and it will be for these specific purposes. At that point, you can ask for consent if that's the route you're going to go down. If you're not going to ask for consent, you need to spell out what your lawful ground for processing is.
Right. So how they can be removed from that system if they want to be.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So you can store. So I guess step one is you can store names and addresses and phone numbers of people, but before you use that, whether it be for marketing or phone calls or putting forward to jobs, you've got to make sure you let them know this is what we're using your information for, and if you don't want this, you can opt out.
Yeah, I mean that we're talking about ideal world here, but okay. This is something that a lot of the recruitment companies we've been working with are sort of grappling with at the moment. They're trying to work out, well, to what extent do we need to build this into our process? At what point are we actually going to contact contacts that we've either found on LinkedIn ourselves or have had scraped off through SourceBreak, whatever it is you've been using? There is an issue, because just because somebody puts their details into the public domain via LinkedIn or whatever other networking site does not mean that you have the legal right to use the data.
We're going to get to LinkedIn in a minute. I've got one more question from Chris Cadd. He said that often what recruiters will do is they'll take a candidate and they'll spec out or reverse market, and they'll say, I've got Bob here, and they'll call people that they know and go, this guy's amazing. Do you have anything that could be good for them? How does that process work now in under GDPR? Can I still spec a candidate's details out there in the market? or is that something I'm not going to be able to do?
As long as you've told them what you're going to do with it, and again, I'm sorry, it gets a little bit sort of boring and legal here, but as long as you've got that lawful basis for processing, and that, which means you have to go back to the, is it consent, is it furtherance of a contract, is it legitimate business purpose? As long as you've got one of those three, and made it absolutely clear to the candidate what you're planning to do with their data.
And is a phone conversation enough for consent? Because what I say and what you hear on a phone call could be different sometimes. Does it have to be written, or can I just say, this is who I'm going to call on your behalf? Are you okay with that?
I think for the purposes of being able to demonstrate you've got the consent, you would want something that you could log. Now, if you phone calls, maybe you could do it that way, but it has to be very clear. It has to be, very, very obvious what you're asking. Everything has to be very specific. And to do that in a conversation is actually quite difficult, because it turns into a sort of almost a legal notice or disclaimer in your conversation. So
what about if I anonymized that profile? So I wrote a candidate profile saying this is the profile of the candidate, but it didn't have any employer. It used different wordage that wasn't on the candidate CV. So you couldn't track back who it was to. As an anonymous spec, could I do that?
That would be different, as long as they could not be identified at all. So it depends on the role, doesn't it? If you're putting somebody forward for a CEO job, most people probably in certain circles would be identifiable. If it's a more sort of junior role where it could be any of 500 people, that's different.
Okay, and so a question from Vic Doig here is there any black and white rule on how long you can retain candidate data for?
No, I wish there was, but there isn't. So for the purpose, for tax purposes, for instance, so if you are paying temps on your payroll as agency temps, you've got to keep that for at least 3 years.
Right, okay.
Probably 6, to be honest, when you look at the PAY and national insurance claims. So you're usually looking at other legal reasons for having to keep data. So unless there is a specific legal reason why you've got to hold on to it, you should not be holding on to it for any longer than absolutely necessary.
So a question someone said here is that isn't specking candidates outside of the laws of GDPR so long as the current candidate is current on your CRM and inside the data holding timeline?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Alex?
What you basically said is that you're not under the premise of GDPR as long as the candidate is already active on your CRM and you've already agreed that you can hold their data for, say, 90 days or whatever.
Well, it's always going to be covered by the GDPR.
Right.
It's like the key question is, does the candidate know exactly what you're planning to do with that data?
Right.
So
okay.
it's about getting that information right in the first place. And sometimes the information you've given will be too narrow, so you've then got to update it.
So what about when often agencies, when they talk to candidates about jobs, will sort of say, oh, I've got a management accounting role. It's in East London. It's 6 months. Do you want to go forward for the job? Because they won't tell the name of the company because they don't want their competitors finding out. So would that be deemed sufficient consent from a candidate if I gave them that sort of general job in a rough area with a rough type of company?
Well, subject to you having issued the information, the fair processing information in the first place. So that has to happen.
Right, okay.
Whatever you then follow up with has to correspond or be within that notice.
Okay.
So, again, it boils down to what did you actually originally say to them? if you're going to go beyond that, you need to contact them to say, well, actually now I'm going to do this with it. But given that you're speaking to them anyway, you're going to be able to update that, I think.
Okay, so but really you should be giving them a company name so they know they're going forward to that specific company.
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
The situation sometimes occurs is I will say, I'm putting you forward for a job in the east of London doing management accounting. I won't put the company name, and another agency will call saying, I'm going to put you forward to a job at Osborne Clarke doing management accounting. And your CV ends up in the same place, which can negatively impact how you're perceived by the client and doesn't do a lot for agency perception.
Yeah.
In that case, who's in the right and who's in the wrong?
I don't know.
But that's
I mean, if your client won't be named, then you won't be able to pass on the name. Why would you not name your client if they were happy for?
Sometimes if I tell a candidate who the job's with, they might speak to another agency and say, I've gone forward for a job with Osborne Clarke, and now that other agency knows about the job at Osborne Clarke, where before that it was only me as Alex that knew about that job.
Right. Okay.
It's like the weird and twisted world of how agency recruiters have to work.
Yeah, no, I realise that, but at the end of the day, I mean, the more specific you can be, and the more contact you can have with the candidate before you start marketing their data, the better.
Yeah, but I think Colin makes
going forward. It may well be that candidates don't deal with as many agencies, partly because of the consent issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think Colin on the chat makes a good point, which is at the end of the day, you can't use someone's data until you get their explicit permission. And I think that's a cultural shift for a few.
You can't, no, not anymore. Yeah. And in many ways, that could be an opportunity because, as you've said all the way along, you would be speaking to these people. Well, it may be a way of speaking to them at an earlier stage in the process. I don't know.
Will it be possible to have a generic statement, which is basically, I'm going to put you on my CRM and may market you to anyone that I see fit at any time in the future? Are you okay with this? And then just click yes because they want to get through to whatever next stage. How would that be perceived?
I would say no, because it's not specific enough.
Okay, right. Okay. So let's. So we've had 27 minutes just on consent, and we've got 2 other topics to get through. So let's go to the other big.
Yeah.
Francis?
Can I just say it's difficult to, I mean, obviously the content of what we're calling a fair processing notice, which is basically the information you give the candidate, is something that we need to look at in context. There probably will, over the next few years, something will come out as being industry standard, but at the moment there isn't anything. So everybody's trying to create something that is going to do what they think needs to protect their business. But I think history suggests that some standard wording will start to emerge, but we're not quite there yet, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I think at the end of the day is that most recruiters see a candidate's data as theirs or the company's rather than the candidate's. And I think if you make the effort to speak to people and give them the opportunity to say no, then which is their right, then I think there's more. It will just hopefully clean up the industry a little bit, whereby people don't find their CV in another company's hands when they've got no idea it's there. So
that's right.
But sort of a bit like. Okay.
Another important thing to remember is that recruiters' clients, so the hiring clients, particularly the bigger brands and anybody who's in the public sector or financial services sector, are going to start to become far more vigilant about GDPR.
Yeah.
And that's a whole another piece to the jigsaw, if you like. But you may find that your clients are starting to say, well, are you sure you've got the right consents in place, or have you checked that this candidate is happy for us to receive these details? There's a whole raft of stuff coming through on that from that end as well.
Yeah, I know a couple of clients, when they get agencies to talk about their jobs, they give the agency a job code. and the candidate has to get that job code written down, and therefore they're then basically saying they won't, when they get another call from that same company, they need to get that job code just to sort of reduce that duplication. So we're going to move now to the next topic, which is around leveraging publicly available data, because recruiters love mining the internet. They love hunting out new people. They love finding profiles and crafting those into either a CRM entry or a profile that they might be able to speak to clients about. So what are some of the sort of false assumptions that recruiters are making around publicly available information on social media?
Well, I think the main one is that because someone has made their data available, their details available on a public network, that means that as a recruiter, you can use that data and that you don't need to get any consent or have any other lawful ground for processing their data. So that goes back to what we've just been discussing. Obviously, when somebody signs up to LinkedIn, they will have signed up to all sorts of privacy information, much of which I've probably forgotten by now. I personally have got no idea what I signed up to. But it doesn't really matter, because LinkedIn isn't there to anticipate what its users will do with the data that they find on LinkedIn. So they can't pass on that lawful processing information to whoever signs up with them. So wherever you're taking candidate data from LinkedIn or anywhere else, again, it goes back to needing to make contact with that individual so that you as an organisation has a right to process their data.
Right. So I can't, without consent, store a candidate's profile on LinkedIn on my CRM without their permission.
I think inevitably what will happen, and what is happening, is that candidates' details are taken off LinkedIn and stored somewhere, whether that be on the CRM or outside the CRM, because obviously both happen. Again, we go back to the whole risk assessment and proportionality point. So I don't think anybody is really suggesting that it's going to be practical for you to contact every single person you scrape off LinkedIn before you decide to do something with their details. But certainly, I think that the best process at the moment would involve you messaging or contacting that individual as soon as possible, and certainly within 30 days of deciding to hold their data, to let them know A, that you've got it, B, what your lawful basis for processing is, and C, what specific purposes for which you're going to use their data.
Right. I guess the key, before you use it, you contact them to get their permission to use it in the way you want to use it.
Yeah.
Right. And so someone said to me that
I think you go down the permission route, which I think you probably would in most cases, or where that's not practical, you look for one of the other grounds.
Yeah. So someone said to me that as long as I can store links on my CRM as to where I can find information about them, but I may not be able to store the data I know about them. So I can have my link. I can have my link to their LinkedIn profile, their link to their Facebook profile, where I can access the information I'd want, and I can do that because I'm allowed to use the link. But I'm not storing their actual data because that's being done on LinkedIn or Facebook.
Yeah, I'd have to check that one, to be honest. I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know. I'm running through the urban myths that are being created. So Steve said on the chat here, just quickly, he says that Steve said basically after 30 days. After 60 days, everyone has the right to be forgotten. So if they've been dealing with you for 60 days or on your CRM for 60 days, they've then got the right to be forgotten. Is that right? Or have they got the right to be forgotten at any point?
I think we're getting to a level of detail now that it's not really something I
Okay, no, that's fine. That's cool. So just to double back on the LinkedIn piece, it's hard not to get dragged into the little details, isn't it, Francis? So what you're saying is that if I find information on LinkedIn, I've just got to be careful about how much of it I store, but more importantly, before I use it, I'm looking to either get consent or to make sure I've got a legitimate business reason for using that information.
Yes.
Okay. Any other sort of mistakes that recruiters could make based on what they think they're allowed to do versus what they are actually allowed to do once GDPR comes in?
Well, I think that, I mean, the probably one thing I think is worth mentioning, and without sort of getting dragged into the last point that you wanted to raise, Alex, is that you know, I hear a lot of people saying, well, you know, what's the point? You know, who's actually going to tell the Information Commission, or who's going to kick up a fuss about this? All they care about is, you know, getting a job. They're not going to mind that we've got their information in our CRM or outside our CRM in somebody's top drawer. You know, they don't really care. They're just candidates. And I think there are some reasons that would potentially become reasons to care, particularly, as I said, if you are looking at some kind of exit or some kind of private equity investment, GDPR compliance, or at least having some sort of program in place which demonstrates that you have considered the risks and that you've got certain risk mitigation in place, is going to become a fairly crucial part of any due diligence on the sale of a business. So that's one thing I would say, and we're already starting to see that happen. The other thing is that under the GDPR, individuals will have a direct right of action. So it means that they'll actually be able to make an application to the court to look at any kind of data breach that they think has happened, and that could actually happen as a group of individuals. So if you had a whole load of, I don't know, IT contractors, for instance, who were suddenly given a rate reduction at one of the big banks, and they were looking for a reason to make life even more difficult for their agency, they may decide to use data protection as a sort of Achilles heel point and bring some sort of claim for compensation. So it could be used cynically and aggressively if you're not careful.
And so if you're nowhere today, as in you've got no real awareness of data protection or what your data flows are, how much do you need to get done by May next year? Because it's very difficult to go from, without breaking your business, it's going to be very difficult to go from here to here, where maybe you need to be.
Which is obviously why you're having this webcast now, Alex, because you're trying to help people prepare in good time.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, the Information Commissioner published something back in August, which was quite reassuring in a way. I mean, whilst they're obviously going to take all of this very seriously, they do realise that this is more of a cultural change than anything else. So they're not expecting there to be a sort of hit the ground running compliant business as of 23rd of May next year. They do see it as a more of an evolutionary process, which is ongoing for an organisation and has to be built into how the organisation works. That's how they want it to work.
Right.
And so they are going to use a sort of more of a carrot than a stick approach initially. It's likely that their enforcement action will be focused on the big brands and very heavy users of data as well. So it's likely to be the usual subjects. I mean, LinkedIn is probably one of them, to be fair. Google, the banks, the big retail companies. But again, you can see that some of these organisations are likely to be the recruiters' clients. So it does have a knock-on effect. So to the extent that the big brands are going to need to demonstrate probably a higher level of compliance as of May next year than anyone else.
We'll be looking at
it is going to lead to questions around compliance and what projects have been put into place.
I guess they'll be looking at compliance through their whole supply chain, a bit like retailers start doing it through the manufacturing process.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're
and that's very relevant to recruitment, because obviously you have got a supply chain, which means that, you know, the getting hold of candidate consent isn't always very straightforward.
Yeah.
You know, in some supply chains, you can have like 4 or 5 different suppliers involved, where you've got an RPO and then you've got somebody working through a PSC or an umbrella company. So it can get quite complicated.
Mm-hmm. Somewhat Neil Phillips just pointed out that final guidance isn't coming out till December 17. So I think it's getting yourself sorted and culturally worked out until you get exact details from the regulator. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the bill came out last week. We've got a pretty good idea of how, what the law is going to look like, but he's right. It takes quite a lot of time and expertise to actually apply that to a whole range of industries, and obviously the guidance can only take a fairly generic viewpoint. So it's intended to be helpful, but they can't focus specifically on any one industry. They'll use some sort of fairly obvious examples in my experience. So there's still quite a lot of work to do to apply it industry by industry, and obviously what we're doing is helping recruiters do that and helping them identify, well, how do we prioritize what we need to do next. That's what we're trying to do at this stage. There is no way of saying we're going to have this sorted by May next year, but there are going to be priority areas that need looking at now, and that's before the guidance comes out.
Great. Well, Francis, you've been a terrific guest, given I've been interrupting and asking about this and asking about that, and we've had questions from the floor as well. Where do people?
I can't very well. I'm trying to read them as I go.
No. You've been great. So obviously there'll be others that might want to reach out to you. So how do people go about finding you in a compliant manner and reaching out after the webinar if they've got extra questions?
I'm very happy. I give my consent to any of you to contact me.
Excellent. Well, and I think Osborne Clarke, is your email number on the Osborne Clarke website, your phone number on the Osborne Clarke website, and that sort of stuff?
Yes, my details are on the Osborne Clarke website. Right. So rather than spell them out, it's probably best to get them there. We've got a recruitment sector section on our website, so it's probably best to go via that, and then you'll get my details from there. Right. And I think, Alex, will you post them as well?
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is, for everybody, I'm going to post, by the end of today, I'm going to post you a link for a recording to the webinar, so you can watch that and play it back with your friends. I'll also include Francis's details, because she's been a terrific guest. And I'm also going to give you the opportunity to opt in and get further invites from Nurture It about other training sessions and other sort of experts that we're going to have on as well. So not assuming the email you've given us so far is anything more than a desire to know about GDPR. So I hope you've really enjoyed it. We're getting lots of thanks down the side. Francis, we got Alan said thanks, Stuart, Chris, Lee, Tracy, Karen. So it's Sam Month.
It's very difficult to do it. I'm sorry, it's really difficult to really answer your questions in such a short space of time.
No worries. But Francis, you've been absolutely terrific, and thanks again. And hopefully, maybe later on down the line, we can have you on again.
Okay.
See you soon. Take care now.